Hello everyone. I have always been so fascinated about how places remember us, how water, land, even silence becomes the part of our stories. When I read Padma Machi and 100 Years of Solitude, written by Macondo and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I realized something. These are not just the stories about people, these are also the stories about the places. The place that holds us, the place that builds us, and the place that entraps us. So, Moynadwip and Macondo, thousands of miles apart, yet they share one similar thing, that is, space becomes the destiny. People often say that space is only a background. It creates the stage for the human action. But here in these two novels, we can see that space is not only a mere background, but that it's the main actor. Here, space is creating history. Here, the space is creating ideologies. Here, the space is creating uh, isolation. And I used to think that isolation is a kind of a feeling, but now I know isolation is not only a feeling, rather it's a structure. It's structured by geography, time, and class. And both writers turn that space into a mirror of human condition, where we can see that every dream of freedom becomes another form of confinement. Manik Bandyopadhyay wrote in 1936 from a Bengal that was ruled by colonial landlords and uh, feudal poverty. We can see that Moynadwip is a dream of escape for those exploited people. Here, this promised land, the Moynadwip, is carrying the sense of renewal. But we can see that this renewal ends up repeating that old hierarchies again and again. 3 decades later, when Marquez imagined Macondo, a Latin American mythic town that was born out of dream, repeats kind of the same structure. Because here we can see that this solitude is not about labor or not about money, but it's about memory. People don't know who they are until time falls back on them. Interestingly, both writers did not know each other, yet they both belong to the same global south and they both are carrying that word of silence throughout their novels. And we can see the same sense of entrapment within the history in both novels. So far, we have discussed about isolations. We will be pinpointing three kinds of isolations: material isolation, metaphysical isolation, and ideological isolation. We will be trying to connect material isolations from Padma Machi and metaphysical isolations from 100 Years of Solitude. And at the same time, we will be trying to understand how ideological isolation is relevant in both texts. So, at first, let's get back to the Padma Machi. In Padma Machi, the isolation or the river Podda is not only a backdrop. Rather, that space, the river Podda, is actually controlling who gets to eat, who gets to live, who gets to sing, and who gets to survive. And when those people move to Moynadwip for a better output or a better future, thinking that that space might be a kinder than the water, but that space doesn't. Rather, that Moynadwip actually controls them even more. In Moynadwip, the soil stays dry and it's very hard to grow crops there. At the same time, we can see that hierarchy again, and they cannot escape that hierarchy. And we can see that that space doesn't free them, rather, it disciplines them more and more because they do not have nowhere to go anymore. They have to live there and they have to live by the rules set by that space. And if we look Manik Bandyopadhyay's portrayal of realism, we can understand that he makes us feel that poverty by the use of space. And here, interestingly, we can use the concept of leftover, the production of space. Here, people are actually producing with their labor the very case that they are living in. So this is a very much interesting thing, I think. In case of 100 years of solitude, the isolation is not material, rather it's much more metaphysical. Though there are some instances that we can identify as material isolation, but that are not very much prevalent. So we will be focusing much more on the metaphysical isolations. What Marquez does is he incorporates magical realism to turn that isolation into a mythical and historical condition. In the text, we can see that the first man of the Buendia family, Jose Arcadio Buendia, escapes the mainland because he wanted to escape the memories of that mainland. So he found Macondo, the place that was untouched and pure. So they started to live there. They still had that history, their memory, but insomnia plague happened, and people started to lose their memories, and they started to lose the sense of who they were. So what happened was that the next generation did not know any more histories and their languages and their sins. So what happens is that those people who did not know that who they were, they started to repeat the same thing their previous generation did. So what happens is that it's now a kind of circle, and that is where uh, we, we can compare those two writers, because what Marquez did, actually Manik Bandyopadhyay failed. The isolation is built into the rhythm of human history. Time moves, but it doesn't actually move, only it cycles around. When it comes to ideological isolation, it gets pretty much interesting. Andre Lefebvre says that space is never neutral. It's never innocent. Rather, it reflects the power who holds them. If we think about Moynadwip, we can see that people went there for a better future and they dreamed about equality. But that dream actually turned into a quite exploitation. If we think about Hossein Mia, the character who actually bought that land and drove those people to that land for his feudalistic impulse, we can see that what he does was that he snatches one's wife and gives it to someone younger, gives her to someone younger. Why? Because all he cared about was the reproduction, and he could snatch someone's wife and give her to someone else because he does have that power. So here we can see that space is isolated, but the power is not. And if we think about 100 years of solitude, what happens there was just a kind of same thing, how power prevails. If we think about the example of the banana company came to Macondo for their expansion of business, and they started to grow bananas and started to export those to America. But over the passage of time, people were reluctant to work with them. So what they did was to force those people into producing more bananas, and eventually it led to a massacre. So what happened that as soon as the massacre happened, we can see that a great deal of raining started to happen, and when that rain actually washes away all those bloods and all those memories within it. So when the Arcadio came back to interrogate what happened there, no one could say anything because they didn't have that memory. So what happens, we can see, is that the space is actually favoring those who have those power. So in both cases, we can see that space is not actually neutral, rather the spaces are actually reflecting who does have that power. At the same time, we can relate it to another idea of Foucault. This is a kind of heterotopia, which means that space is actually kind of utopia. It presents itself as utopia but hides a kind of control behind the curtain. If we put Moynadwip and Macondo side by side, we can understand that they tell a similar story, but in a different accent, in a different aesthetics. In both texts, they both are born out of colonial histories, shaped by water and jungle, and they both are haunted by failures. In both texts, people are dreaming of escaping, but they return to the same entrapment. And this entrapment is happening within a space. But that doesn't mean that the struggle is against the space, it's against the history of power. And space is where that power lies. And space is where people dream. And space is where the despair returns. And together, they create a shared post colonial geography that stretches the solitude over the world. So, maybe that's what solitude means, not being alone, but unable to escape the world you have made.